You are who they approved you to be, not who you chose to be. Whoever survived the filter of other people's approval for long enough to seem, from the inside, like a choice of your own. There is a moral imperative that runs through all of contemporary culture with the force of an obvious truth. Know yourself. Know who you are. Have clarity about your values, your limits, your identity. This imperative appears in therapy, in self-help books, in pedagogies that promise human development, in conversations between people who consider themselves lucid and reflective. Knowing who you are is a virtue. Having a clear identity is health. Reaching a point where you can say, "I know who I am," is the implicit goal of almost every journey of self-knowledge that modern culture recognizes as valid. And it is exactly here, at this point of arrival that everyone celebrates, that the inversion begins. Because there is a question that the imperative of self-knowledge systematically prevents you from asking, where did the self you know come from? Who decided before you what counts as being authentic? Who defined before you what it means to be yourself? If the identity you carry emerged from a genuine process of openness to your own being, if it is the result of you having inhabited your existence without the constant mediation of what others needed you to be, then it is what it seems to be. But if it emerged from another process, from the accumulated filter of social approval, from the repeated performance of what worked in the context you inhabited, from what survived external judgment over the years, then what you call who I am may be something else entirely. It may be the inventory of a well-decorated prison, comfortable enough to never seem like a prison. Heidegger had a name for this, and the diagnosis will completely reorganize what you understand about authenticity. There is a specific form of confused morality that doesn't appear in obvious ethical dilemmas. It is not the confusion between right and wrong in situations of difficult choice. It is a prior and deeper confusion, the confusion between genuine identity and administered identity, between the self that emerged from real openness to one's own being and the self that was constructed by the accumulation of external approvals over time. And what makes this confusion so effective is that it is completely invisible from the inside. You don't experience the administered identity as administered, you experience it as you, as character, as what you genuinely are, regardless of what others think. But observe a pattern honestly. When you describe who you are to someone who doesn't know you, when you put into words your values, your positions, the characteristics you consider central to your person, where do the descriptions come from? Are they formulations that emerged from you, in silence, from your direct relationship with your own existence? Or are they formulations that were validated over time, that worked well in conversations, that received confirmation, that survived the test of being recognized by others? Most people who examine this question honestly find a disturbing proportion. Much of what they call themselves arrived from outside, was validated by others, and was internalized so completely that it lost the memory of having arrived from somewhere before becoming their own. This is not moral weakness. It is a structural mechanism that Heidegger identified as the default state of human existence, and that the culture of self-knowledge can, paradoxically, deepen rather than resolve. Observe the mechanism in your own movements with clinical attention. You have an opinion about something, a position you consider genuinely yours, one you would sustain in any conversation, because it emerges from what you truly think. Now trace the genealogy of that opinion. Where did it come from? Did you arrive at it alone, in silence, after direct examination of the matter? Or did you arrive at it through the path of recognition, that it was formulated in a context where it worked well, that it was received with approval by people whose judgment mattered to you, that it survived repeated social use until it became part of the repertoire of what you are? There is no dishonesty in this. No one formulates identity in a vacuum. We are social beings. The language we use to think was inherited. The concepts through which we understand ourselves were transmitted. Every identity has a social genealogy. The problem is not having an identity with a social genealogy. The problem is when that genealogy is completely invisible, when what was constructed by the filter of external approval seems from the inside, like an innate inner voice. Observe also what happens when something threatens the identity you carry. Someone presents an argument that contradicts a position you consider central to who you are. The most common reaction is not curiosity, it is defense. Not because the argument is necessarily weak, but because attacking the position seems like attacking the person. The position and the identity have fused to such a degree that questioning it is felt as an existential threat, not as an intellectual invitation. Heidegger would call this state closure, the Dasein, that confused a particular configuration of its own existence with existence itself. That stopped asking questions because it believes it has arrived. That transformed self-knowledge, which should be a continuous openness to one's own being, into a well-decorated identity enclosure. And the paradox we are going to dissect is this: the culture you inhabit does not merely allow this closure, it encourages it. It calls it health. It calls it maturity. It calls it precisely being yourself. So what is wrong with knowing who you are? Apparently, nothing. The imperative seems solid. Without some degree of identity stability, life becomes adrift. Without values that remain constant across contexts, there is incoherence that borders on the absence of character. Without some answer to the question, who am I? The human being seems lost. But there is a distinction that the imperative of self-knowledge tends to erase, and that Heidegger considered the most important distinction philosophy could offer to the concrete human being. The difference between an identity that is a continuous openness to one's own being and an identity that is a closure around who the impersonal has already decided you are. This distinction is not obvious, and the difficulty of making it is not intellectual. It is existential, because the two look identical from the inside. The authentic Dasein and the Dasein surrendered to Das Man both carry an identity. Both can describe who they are. Both feel that what they describe is genuinely theirs. The difference is not in the content of the identity, it is in the relationship with it, in the disposition to remain open to what is not yet, to what could be different, to the possibility that the current configuration of existence is not the destination, but only the point at which existence currently finds itself. Heidegger was not prescribing instability or incoherence. He was diagnosing something far more precise: the difference between inhabiting one's own existence as openness and inhabiting it as arrival. And what modern culture did, with a subtlety that makes the diagnosis especially disturbing, was to transform arrival into a moral ideal, into a point of honor, into a sign of human development. Martin Heidegger developed In Being and Time, published in 1927, one of the most radical and most disturbing diagnoses that Western philosophy has ever produced about the human condition. Not about what human beings do, but about what they are, and about the specific way in which they tend to flee from what they are. The central concept for this diagnosis is Das Man, which in German translates roughly as the impersonal, the one, what everyone does, what is done. Heidegger used the term to describe a mode of existence, the default mode, the mode of least resistance, in which the human being is not being themselves, but being what the anonymous collective decides one should be. Das Man has no face. It is not a specific person, not an identifiable institution, not a conspiracy with a name. It is a diffuse, distributed, completely invisible regime because it is made up of the voice of everyone and no one at the same time. It is the one of that's how it's done, of that's what's expected, of a person like that would. And it operates not from outside inward, but from within, because it was internalized so deeply that it came to seem like one's own voice. For Heidegger, the Dasein, the concrete, situated temporal human being who exists in a specific world, is for the most part surrendered to Das Man. Not out of weakness, not out of lack of character, because that surrender is structurally easier than the alternative. The alternative, what Heidegger called authentic existence, requires the Dasein to genuinely appropriate its own existence, to open itself to what it is without the filter of what the impersonal decided it should be. And here is the inversion that will unsettle with precision. The contemporary culture of self-knowledge, with its entire repertoire of therapy, reflective practices, language of purpose, and imperatives to know who you are, may be, paradoxically, one of the most sophisticated forms through which Das Man operates, because it defines, before the individual, what counts as being authentic. It establishes the criterion of what it means to be yourself. And in doing so, it makes the individual dependent on collective judgment to evaluate whether they are being genuine, which is, structurally, the opposite of what genuine authenticity would require. Heidegger was not preaching radical individualism. He was not saying that social influence is automatically inauthentic. He was saying something far more precise, that authenticity is not a specific content of identity, but a relationship with one's own existence, a disposition to remain open to one's own being, not to confuse the current configuration of existence with the destination, not to close around a version of oneself as if it were the final point, rather than a point along the way, and that the culture which transforms self-knowledge into a moral virtue, which rewards those who know who they are, and treats identity uncertainty as a failing, is structurally reinforcing the closure that Heidegger diagnosed as inauthenticity. This diagnosis is nearly 100 years old, and it hasn't aged at all. Let's open the mechanism with precision. Heidegger distinguished between two modes of existence, not as fixed states, but as dispositions, ways of relating to one's own existence that coexist in the same human being and alternate with each other, with inauthenticity being the state of least resistance, and authenticity being what requires an active reclaiming. In the inauthentic mode, the mode of Das Man, the Dasein exists in a state of fallenness, absorbed in the world of objects and tasks, interpreting itself by the criteria the impersonal provides, calmed by the certainty of knowing who it is and what it is worth. This state is not anguishing, it is comfortable. It is the state in which existence seems resolved, in which the fundamental questions seem to have been answered, in which there is a stable identity that provides orientation without requiring continuous openness to one's own being. In the authentic mode, the mode Heidegger called the ownmost, the Dasein genuinely appropriates its own existence. It recognizes finitude, inhabits the anguish that openness to being produces, remains open to what is not yet. This state is uncomfortable. It requires sustaining the uncertainty of not having arrived, of not fully knowing who one is, of remaining in relation to one's own existence instead of having closed the process of becoming who one is. Now observe what the culture of self-knowledge does with this distinction. It identifies the authentic state, in the Heideggerian sense, as problematic. A person who doesn't know who they are is perceived as immature, in crisis, in need of development. A person who knows who they are, who has clarity about their values and identity, who can precisely describe what defines them, that person is perceived as healthy, developed, arrived somewhere. But the identity clarity that culture celebrates as arrival may be, precisely, the closure that Heidegger diagnosed as inauthenticity, not because clarity is always false, but because the disposition to close, to declare arrival, to stop asking, is the disposition that Das Man needs you to have. A Dasein that remains open, that is not certain about who it is, that keeps asking, that maintains uncertainty as an honest condition of existence, is a Dasein far harder to govern through the impersonal. Because the impersonal needs a stable identity to operate upon, it needs a self that knows who it is in order to confirm or deny that identity, to provide the criteria by which the self evaluates whether it is being authentic. A self that remains open partially escapes this logic, not because it is better or stronger, but because it refuses the arrival that the system needs it to declare. This is not comfortable. Heidegger was precise on this point. Authenticity is not comfortable, and the comfort of clear identity is frequently the most precise signal that Das Man operated successfully. Self-knowledge can be the honest mapping of one's own existence, or it can be the detailed inventory of a prison you yourself furnished. The difference lies in how you relate to what you find, as an openness that keeps questioning, or as an arrival that closed the process. Heidegger diagnosed the second mode as inauthenticity not because the content of the identity is necessarily false, but because the disposition to close, to know who one is with enough certainty to stop asking, is the disposition that surrenders the Dasein to das Man. The well-decorated prison doesn't look like a prison from the inside. It looks like home. It looks like character. It looks like finally having arrived at yourself. And the comfort of that feeling is precisely what Heidegger used as the diagnostic criterion for inauthenticity. The cultural imperative to be yourself presupposes that there is a stable, identifiable, discernible self, and that the problem is simply to find it and express it without constraint. But Heidegger identified something that this narrative erases. The impersonal also defines what counts as being yourself. It establishes the criteria of authenticity before you use them to evaluate yourself. And so by following the imperative to be authentic according to the criteria that Das Man provides, you are not escaping the impersonal. You are fulfilling its most sophisticated function. Fabricated authenticity is more efficient than open conformity because it is voluntary, felt as one's own choice, and completely immune to the criticism that exposed conformity would receive. You think you are being yourself. Das Man counts on that. Heidegger identified existential anguish, not anxiety about specific events, but the vertigo of existing without a guaranteed foundation, of being free without a given destination, as the state in which the Dasein has the most direct access to its own existence. Not because anguish is pleasant, but because it is the state in which Das Man loses its effectiveness. At the depths of anguish, the identity certainties the impersonal provides reveal themselves for what they are: contingent constructions, not necessary essences. Contemporary culture treats identity anguish as a symptom to be treated, as a sign of incomplete development, as a problem to be resolved through self-knowledge. Heidegger treated it as a sign that the Dasein is close to something real, and the flight from anguish back to identity certainty as the movement by which the impersonal reconquers the territory it had temporarily lost. Now the diagnosis deepens to the most disturbing layer, the one that makes the discomfort of this subject inescapable. The problem is not that you have an identity. The problem is the relationship you maintain with it. And Heidegger was precise about what distinguishes the two possible relationships. Observe how you react when someone questions something you consider central to who you are. Not a superficial criticism, a genuine, articulate questioning that presents a perspective contradicting something you have always assumed to be part of what you are. If the reaction is defensive, if the first need is to protect the position instead of examining it, if the questioning seems like a threat instead of an invitation, that is a data point. Not about the validity of the questioned position, about the relationship you maintain with it, about the degree to which the position and the identity have fused to the point that questioning it is felt as an attack on the person. Heidegger would call this state Verfallenheit, fallenness, decadence. The Dasein that falls into Das Man does not fall with violence. It falls with comfort, with the satisfaction of having arrived, with the security of knowing who it is. And the fall is so gentle that the Dasein does not perceive it as a fall. It perceives it as a landing. What the culture of confused morality produces, and what makes the diagnosis especially disturbing, is a context in which the fall is systematically rewarded, where identity certainty is celebrated, where clarity of values is a sign of health, where those who know who they are receive social approval that those who remain open do not receive. And so the Dasein learns, not through explicit instruction, but through accumulated feedback, that closing is better than remaining open, that arriving is better than continuing to walk, that knowing who you are is socially worth more than continuing to ask. Observe also how the language of self-knowledge operates on identity uncertainty. When someone says, "I don't really know who I am," the default cultural response is to treat this as a problem to be solved, as a temporary state of incomplete development that therapy, reflection, and self-knowledge will cure. Uncertainty is pathologized. Not knowing is diagnosed as a problem, not as honesty. But Heidegger suggested the opposite, that the Dasein that doesn't really know who it is may be in a more honest relationship with its own existence than the one that knows exactly who it is. That uncertainty can be openness, not failure. That not knowing can be the state in which existence remains genuinely alive, rather than enclosed in a configuration that the impersonal validated and that the Dasein now defends as if it were a necessary essence instead of a contingent choice. This does not mean that uncertainty is always healthy or that stability is always inauthentic. Heidegger was far more precise than that. What he diagnosed was not the content of the identity, it was the relationship with it, the disposition to remain open to one's own being, to sustain the possibility that what you are right now does not exhaust what you can be, to not confuse the current configuration of existence with the destination. And this disposition, the openness that Heidegger considered the most characteristic trait of authenticity, is exactly what the cultural imperative to know who you are systematically undoes. Because the imperative asks for arrival, it asks for certainty, it asks for a stable identity that can be described, defended, presented as what one genuinely is. And by obeying the imperative, the Dasein hands Das Man exactly what Das Man needs, a fixed, identifiable self whose criteria of authenticity were established by the anonymous collective even before the individual began to ask who they were. You are who they approved you to be, not who you chose to be. And the most disturbing part, you probably feel that you chose. We've reached the core, and it is perhaps the most vertiginous of the entire diagnosis. The confused morality that this video dissected is not in any obvious ethical choice. It is in the very foundation of what contemporary culture calls self-knowledge. In the imperative to know who you are that is celebrated as virtue, but that may be structurally the most sophisticated form by which the impersonal ensures that you remain who it has already decided you are. The inversion that Heidegger demands is this: the identity you carry with confidence, that you describe when asked who you are, that you defend when questioned, that you use as a compass to evaluate what is authentic and what is not. That identity emerged from a process you did not deliberately choose. It emerged from the filter of accumulated social approval, from the repeated performance of what worked, from what survived external judgment for long enough to seem interior. This does not make the identity false. It makes it contingent, which is something entirely different. And the difference between an identity felt as necessary and an identity recognized as contingent is the difference between the Dasein enclosed in Das Man and the Dasein that begins to genuinely appropriate its own existence. The signal that you are in the second state is not comfort. It is exactly the opposite. It is the specific anguish of perceiving that what you called yourself may be, in no small proportion, the result of who others needed you to be, of perceiving that being yourself was defined before you by an impersonal regime that has no face, but that was present in every approval you received and in every disapproval that shaped you. This perception is what Heidegger called the call of conscience, not a voice that says what to do, but a silence that interrupts the noise of Das Man. That temporarily withdraws the identity certainty the impersonal provided, and that returns the Dasein to the question it should never have stopped asking: who are you becoming, instead of who you already are? You are not arriving. You are on the way, and now you know the difference. Now the phenomenon is entirely readable, and in all its disturbing precision. The moral imperative to know yourself, presented by contemporary culture as the goal of human development, as a sign of health, as the point of arrival of maturity, may be structurally the mechanism by which the impersonal ensures that the Dasein remains surrendered to an identity that did not emerge from genuine openness to one's own being, but from the accumulated filter of social approval over time. Heidegger was not preaching that identity is an illusion or that self-knowledge is useless. He was diagnosing something far more precise, that the disposition to close, to know who one is, with enough certainty to stop asking, is the disposition that Das Man needs in order to operate without resistance, and that a culture which rewards identity certainty and pathologizes openness to not knowing is structurally reinforcing the mode of existence that Heidegger identified as inauthentic. Confused morality is not in knowing the difference between right and wrong. It is in confusing arrival with openness, identity certainty with authenticity, what they approved you to be with what you are becoming. The self you carry with confidence may be genuine, but the degree to which you can remain in an interrogative relationship with it, rather than merely defending it, is the only criterion Heidegger would recognize as an indicator of real authenticity. Look back with this diagnosis active and see what it reorganizes. Every time you described who you are with confidence, every time identity was presented as a point of arrival rather than a point along the way, Das Man was operating, not necessarily with false content, but with the wrong relationship, the relationship of closure instead of openness. Every time a questioning of something you consider central to who you are was received as a threat instead of an invitation, every time the need to defend the position preceded the need to examine it, the Dasein was surrendered to the impersonal, protecting an identity that the impersonal validated as if it were a necessary essence. Every time the anguish of not quite knowing who you are was felt as a problem to be solved instead of as the state in which existence is most honestly in relationship with itself, Das Man reconquered the territory that the anguish had temporarily opened. Heidegger lived with this tension. He did not resolve it. Being and Time is an unfinished book. The second part, in which he intended to develop the path out of inauthenticity more completely, was never written. What remained is the diagnosis, precise, brutally honest, without the resolution that most would expect from a philosophical work about how to live. Perhaps not by accident, perhaps because the resolution would itself be a form of Das Man, the arrival that the system needs you to declare in order to operate you. The self that remains open to its own being has no arrival to offer. It has only the continuous movement of an existence that has not confused the point where it currently stands with the destination to which it belongs. Heidegger left a tension he never resolved, and that cannot be resolved from the outside, that only exists as tension when inhabited from within. The question is this: if clear identity is frequently the sign that Das Man operated successfully, and if openness to not knowing is frequently the state in which existence is most honestly in relationship with itself, how do you distinguish in practice between genuine openness and irresponsible drift, between the Dasein that remains in honest questioning about who it is becoming and the one that simply never built anything worth sustaining? Heidegger did not answer this directly, and the absence of a direct answer is not a philosophical failure, it is precision, because an answer that could be applied by everyone from outside would itself be a formulation of Das Man, the anonymous collective criterion that decides, before the individual, what counts as genuine openness. The question that remains, with no answer I can give you: how much of what you call who I am is openness to being, a living interrogative relationship, willing to be disturbed by what you don't yet know about yourself? And how much is the inventory of a well-decorated prison, the detailed mapping of an identity that the impersonal validated and that you now defend as if it were essence rather than history? You don't need to answer that right now, but now you know the question exists, and that the comfort of not asking it is not a sign that you have arrived. It is a sign that Das Man is still operating. Heidegger offers no arrival at the end, and neither will this screenplay, because the diagnosis you move through does not close with a solution. There is no correct position that, once adopted, resolves the tension between authenticity and Das Man. The tension is structural. It is in the very condition of being human in a social world, and any resolution that seemed definitive would itself be the most sophisticated form by which the impersonal would reconquer the lost ground. What the diagnosis offers is only the distinction between identity as openness and identity as closure, between the self that keeps questioning and the self that declared having arrived, between what you are becoming and what they approved you to be. That distinction does not comfort. but it is the only one that has enough precision to be useful. Antidote doesn't give you authenticity. It gives you the name of what prevents it. If this video disturbed something you want someone else to examine, subscribe to the channel, and more than that, share it with whoever you think needs to hear this. The next video is already being prepared.